Good afternoon, Excellencies, dear guests, dear friends of Capacity4Change. Welcome on behalf of GIZ Brussels here in the GIZ Representation. First, thank you very much to our speakers who could make the time to come from far away. A special thanks to Defco and Nathalie for working with us on this format and on this conference. I should mention Iris Müller. Where is she? Iris, over there. Thank you very much for devotion to develop the program together with Claudia, who's over there. Thank you for everybody who contributes to this program. I'm happy to see many of my colleagues here from partner organizations from the European Commission. It's a timely topic. I think we all know that, and I'm specifically happy that in these difficult times in Brussels, we could organize the meeting here in our representation. Mike Falke will say more about the topic and the background. I only have the pleasure to say a few words about the format we have been using. I will do this with 3 sentences, but before moving to C4C, Capacity4Change, let me also specifically welcome SHADA Islam, SHADA over there. Thank you very much for working with us today. Usually it's the other way around. Thank you for moderating the panel. Now, I have the pleasure just to remind you of what we try to do with Capacity4Change. I will do this in 2 parts. One is, I have the pleasure to advertise a book. Usually this is done by one of our board members. Capacity Works is the Bible, our Bible, I would say, how to make changes possible. I want to refer you to that. There will be a copy outside, so when leaving you can also have a look at what is inside. It's really worth to see it. Second, with the Capacity4Change format, we want to enrich in Brussels the public debate about crucial issues for international development. And we want to do that by bringing expertise and experience from the field to the public debate here in Brussels. Moreover, what we also try to do with the technology you see around is we want to connect the Brussels bubble with colleagues in other cities in Europe and in other continents. And we, I think, are connected today specifically to Eschborn, to the headquarters. I don't know, I cannot see our colleagues, but if they see me, a welcome to all of you in Eschborn and in other places, because the idea is that in the future, we would like to have a peer-to-peer connection to other institutes and colleagues also in other places, with partner organizations to make it possible for them to specifically get involved, in particular with interactive means. That is the idea, and we will introduce that in the future. Moreover, and finally, this meeting will not just be live streamed, it will be available on a specific C4C YouTube channel after the meeting for those who could not see it, but obviously if you want to just repeat, to be reminded of what was discussed, it is open to everybody. So thank you very much again for coming. I'm sure it will be an interesting short afternoon, and I would like to give the floor to Mike. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends and partners, let me welcome you in the name of GIZ's group on sector programs and global programs on good governance and human rights. But let me first of all thank Professor Fischer and his team for hosting this event, and also our program on good financial governance, Anke Scholz and its team to organize it from a topic side. I have to say I'm very impressed to see this room not half empty, but really packed, and there are hardly any chairs left. That, I think, is a very good indication that today's topic is more relevant than ever. The issue of good financial governance in states in distress becomes more and more a very, very important element of not only German, but also, I think, European development cooperation. Fragility of states has become a major challenge in the last couple of years, especially of development cooperation. Just to mention that 1.5 billion people in the world live in fragile or conflict environments. On the other side, I can report that more than half of GIZ's operations are implemented in nowadays are implemented in these environments. Effects of fragility come closer to us, as you all have witnessed in the last couple of weeks. The refugee crisis, for example, is one of the visible impacts we have, and impacts stemming from these fragile environments. What is important in states in a fragile situation to have flexible and efficient financial governance. For example, in the refugee crisis, host countries, for example, have to be flexible in order to shift spendings and financial resources to places where they are most needed. On the other hand, in countries of origin, tax bases are more and more eroding because people are leaving, taxpayers are leaving. I think a crucial element. It is important in host countries to, for example, target and support these municipalities which are most burdened with the refugee issue. Bad financial governance, on the other side, has a crucial impact in fragility, and it's most importantly, it's undermining the state legitimacy. You have, I mean, not to mention other elements which are equally important. For example, just to mention here, the rule of law or human rights. The absence, on the other hand, of state legitimacy is a key driver of fragility. If you don't have a legitimate state, you're easily going into a fragile situation. We have witnessed that in, for example, the Arab Spring, but also the Maidan revolution, or currently seen in Iceland. And another, maybe last very, very up-to-date topic I would like to mention, Panama Papers. The Panama Papers have just underlined the importance of a good financial governance system on a global scale, how important it is that finances across borders, and we have now a situation where the financial system is very global, and it has very clear linkages between developed countries on the one side and developing countries on the other side. I would like not to go deeper into the topic because we have a panel discussion which will really tackle the issues at stake from different perspectives, and would be more than happy to hand over to the panel and wish us and you a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome again also from our side. We are from the sector program Good Financial Governance based in Eschborn, and during the past month we have tried to put a little bit more highlight on the question of how good financial governance can strengthen states in distress. And there we organized a study and really tried to focus on what are the needs in providing advisory services in fragile situations, and how we could do advisory service in a better way in those really different contexts. So we will start off with a short overview of what it actually means, fragility, then apply our good financial governance approach towards fragile states, and then Stephanie will take over and give an overview about the actual key findings of the study when it comes to policy recommendations. So starting with a definition, it's actually hard to define fragility. On the global level, the debate goes in all different directions, so there's no such one definition of what fragility means. We stuck towards the BMZ definition, which has three key aspects. The first one is a security issue, so to say there's no basic provision of a secure environment for the population. That's mainly seen in conflicts such as in the Ukraine, we saw that, but also in civil wars, etc., just to mention some of the examples. Then there's a legitimacy problem, so the state cannot provide a legitimate state structures with very weak accountable systems. And then the third point that is mainly mentioned is a capacity lack problem. So the state is not able to provide a subsistent delivery of basic governmental services to its population. Going further, we try to apply our approach. So that is the good financial governance approach, which is a holistic way of looking at PFM reform systems, and it's a value-based approach. So we not only regard technical aspects, which you can see below in the green part, so that are the core PFM topics like revenues, advising a public budget, financial control, but we combine those with the normative aspects and the political economy dimension. What that looks like when we analyze fragile contexts, we are going to see now. So when we looked at the political economy dimension, we found out that political commitments to higher order objectives, so for instance a revolution or a political upheaval, could also lead to more reform drivers in PFM reforms. Moreover, we also saw what everybody of you probably expects, that the institutional capacity is a lot lower when compared to non-fragile contexts, which is again then also reflected in indices and assessments such as the PIFA assessments, which show considerably lower scores on PFM topics than non-fragile contexts. If we dig a little bit deeper into the technical dimension, we saw that when putting in contrast a fragile context to non-fragile context, particularly accountability functions were extremely weak, and also internal control systems and procurement practices were stated as being definitely weaker than non-fragile contexts. Based on performance, we saw that upstream processes such as budget planning were better in fragile contexts than downstream processes, so internal and external control functions were extremely weak. Also, we could see that when we looked at reform complexity, and I saw that there are many other donors here in the room, which might be very interesting for you, that the more complex reforms we advised, the least successful they were. So very complex reforms such as program-based budgeting reforms or introductions of MTEFs were rather regarded as unsuccessful. Also, we saw that there was insufficient attention to line ministries, both on a TA level, so technical assistance from donors given wasn't represented as much as it should, but also from the national capacity perspective. I would lead over to the next dimension, which is the normative aspects when it comes to fragile contexts. And they're also looking at PFM topics. The OBI score, which looks at budget transparency mainly, showed that scores were considerably lower in the fragile countries in contrast to other portfolio relevant developing countries. Also, pro-poor and sustainable policy design was weak, so national poverty reduction strategies were often not linked towards budget planning and execution. We could also see that higher levels of GDP were associated with better results in PFM reforms. And then another cooperation issue, which is particularly linked to fragile context, is the New Deal, which was assigned in 2011 between donors and fragile situations, which lines out several principles on working with fragile countries. And one aspect that was seen as being particularly positive was that a longer PFM support, so the longer the TA project tends to be implemented, the better are de jure, so judiciary reform projects and downstream reforms being experienced. And Stephanie will now come to the real drivers of the reform.
Thank you, Svenja. In our study, we also looked at 6 case studies, and these were GIZ, GFG programs implemented in fragile or post-conflict countries. We looked at programs in Afghanistan, Burkina Faso, Nepal, Ukraine, Sierra Leone, and Georgia. I want to highlight some of the key reform drivers from 3 country examples. In Nepal, GIZ is implementing since the late 1990s already a tax revenue program. So there you can already see, okay, the long-term commitment of GIZ has proven to be very valuable. Also proven valuable has been that GIZ was also flexible to adapt its approaches over time, also during difficult processes when there was a civil war going on, but also during the earthquake. For example, GIZ could focus its focus on technical reforms during difficult political times. So the program is mainly focusing on implementing ICT program and for the revenue system, which is especially after the latest earthquake proven to be very valuable because a lot of the data could be recovered also, even though like the papers were destroyed. Also in Nepal, the program and also the government side could depend on a well-educated pool of human and business capacity, which was also strengthened by the program. As a second example, we want to look at Ukraine. One driver of reform has been a greater political will to reform after the Maidan revolution. However, the caveat here is that it's also quite donor-driven, but you can get the political will a little bit from both sides. Proven very valuable has also an instrument of peer mentoring, where civil servants from Germany and the UK were actually implemented on short and longer term basis within the partner institution in the public administration, which proved very valuable because on the one hand, tailor-made advice could be provided because the advisors are very close to the partners. Also, a trust system could be established. As a last example, we're going to look at Sierra Leone, where GIZ is implementing a good financial governance reform program for the resource sector. Here, a driver of reform has been from the government side a clear political will, probably also partially due to the fact that mismanagement of resources has been a driver of the conflict, of the civil war. Again, it proved well that GIZ is very close to the partners, that they have advisors embedded within the institution, which enabled them also to identify pockets of strong technical capacity and also leverage them. One example is here the setup of a national minerals agency. And as a last point, it's proven to be very well that capacity building is not only targeted toward the development of policies or regulations, but that the program also really worked on the implementation of these programs, like strengthen the cooperation between different partner organizations. Yes, and now we want to finalize with our key findings from the studies. So the first one is good news. You can have progress on GFG reform even through acute crisis. So we should all continue to work in these states, in fragile states, even during times of crisis. Afghanistan is one example where indices for public financial management efficiency have really increased during the last 10 years. However, there remains the question of sustainability, especially now, like for the case of Afghanistan, where aid is a little bit winding down. It's proven to be well to use the holistic good financial governance approach. So a coherent approach, looking at all the aspects of good financial governance, on the revenue side, over expenditure to oversight mechanisms. Of course, political commitment is key. This is also nothing new. GIZ programs have been here particularly successful because they have been very close to the partners, so they could also leverage political commitment and identify it where it existed. Yeah. And next one. You have to foster pockets of strong capacity. Here you have to consider the trade-off that, of course, strengthening human capacity takes a long time, whereas sometimes organizational change, there can be also quick wins, which are but more rather donor-driven and not really endogenous change. Then, of course, donor coordination is very necessary. All programs should maybe even fund opportunities to do this and proactively engage in the donor dialogue. And again, as mentioned before, GIZ's key quality for facilitating institutional change in fragile states, it's probably not only limited to good financial governance programs, is that its programs are often very flexible, responsive, and use an adaptive approach, which can also be changed during times of crisis or political changes. Now the question also a little bit for the now following debate is how can we use this strength like for German development cooperation when our work environment gets increasingly hostile. We recently had to reduce our staff in Afghanistan, totally stop working in Yemen. So how we can continue to leverage our strength in these environments. You all have also the USB sticks. You found them on your chair, where you can find the draft of the study. So if you find the time to read it and can send us some comments during the next week, we would love to incorporate them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie and Sonia. I'm Shada Islam, Director of Policy at Friends of Europe, and it's my pleasure to moderate this panel discussion that's going to follow this very insightful PowerPoint, which made some very strong points about good financial governance in fragile states, but also in fragile contexts, I think, which is very important. So I'm going to ask our panelists to please come and join me here. I will introduce them once they have taken their seats. Yes, please. To come in here. I'm here? Yes. You can sit here when you're. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Claudia. Yes. We have a transatlantic person joining us as well. Okay, so once again, let me just introduce our panelists. So we have Nathalie Brajad-Bonstein from the European Commission. She's from the Development DG and Head of Budget Support Sector. So Nathalie, thank you very much for coming. Also Mohammed Hassan El-Haj from the IMF. He's the coordinator for Middle East Regional Assistance Center. And you'll be giving us some of your insights on MITAC's performance in fragile states. Also, PHILIPP KRAUSE, Overseas Development Institute, Head of Center for Public Expenditure. We have Verena Fritz joining us from Washington, D.C., from the World Bank, Senior Public Sector Specialist. Verena, hi. I hope you can see us and hear us. Yes?
Yes, I can hear you and see you. It does break off sometimes, but it does come back.
Okay, great. We'll be patient, and I hope you will be patient as well. And last but not least, to my right, Munir Rashid from the Ministry of Finance of Lebanon. So let me take a seat here, and let's kick off with you, Nathalie. So you've heard and seen the different elements of this discussion that have been put forward by Sonia and Stephanie. What strikes you the most, and what do you think is the most important bits of what they've said in your work at the European Commission when you're dealing with fragile states and fragile contexts?
Yes, thank you, Shada, and thank you to GIZ for hosting us. And it's a pleasure for me today to be part of this panel. To reply of your question, I would say what is the most important, this is to continue to work with fragile state, and this is one of the conclusions of the study. Definitely, this is what we try to do with flexible, responsive, and adaptive approach, as it was also one of the conclusions of the study. Clearly, this is what we have tried to develop with the state building contract, which is the new instrument that we have now developed for 3 years at the level of the European Commission. And the idea is really to be able to continue to support the situation, even in the case of very severe fiscal distress, even if a very, very volatile situation, to be able to continue to work with these countries. And the PFM issue is certainly one of the main components of these instruments, and this is the essential part of this program that we implement for these countries. We have, for the time being, all around the world, in 15 countries, some state building contracts. So this is quite important. And for each type of, we don't have twice the same type of program. This is each time a case basis approach, tailor-made, dynamic approach, forward-looking approach, and the eligibility criteria of our budget support are assessed in this way. As regard the PFM eligibility criteria, this is essential, of course, to have a to support the core function covering within especially the budget cycle, notably the budget availability, the treasury system, and the mechanism of reporting of budget execution. If we have this key core function, we are able to intervene with the budget support in the fragile countries. So it means that PFM could be seen, the improved PFM performance in fragile countries, that can be seen as an outcome of the program and not as a precondition. We are really ready, of course, taking into account the level of risk and the expected result, but we are really ready to start even with a very weak PFM system and to support the country in this direction. In terms of course, this is important to have a very coordinated, and this is something which has been also said, a very coordinated approach with other partner to take into account all the risks, but also the cost of non-intervention, which is in this type of context could be a determinant factor to decide to go ahead with a state building contract, and to have a very quick response, because the context of volatility can be so fragile that the windows of opportunity to go ahead can be very limited and can be closed very suddenly. So this is important to go in a massive way with a lot of, as much as possible, a lot of financial funds, as quick as possible, in a very pragmatic way and flexible way.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. So you have to speak very closely into your microphone for the web streaming. So I have a follow-up question for you, actually, Natalie. In terms of, you said 15 countries where you are involved at the moment, and the focus is very much, obviously, on building resilience in these countries. to the shocks and to...
Yes, we have exactly the same definition of fragility. So fragility, this is the fragility of the situation. So we have fragile countries, we support fragile countries which are face a very structural fragility, but that could be also a fragility of situation, transition. And we have a state building contract, as you have mentioned, in Ukraine, but also in Tunisia, which are more faced to a fragility situation of transition, of fragile situation, rather than a fragility, institutional fragility. So that could be both type of fragilities.
Right. Just for the participants, we'll be opening the floor to questions once our panelists have made some comments, and I've done a few follow-up questions. So keep your questions in your powder dry. Keep your powder dry. Let me turn now to Mohammed Hassan. Mohammed, you are working on the Regional Technical Assistance Center in the Middle East. What have you done so far in terms of improving, upgrading resilience, and dealing with countries in the region that are actually in very fragile states?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank GIZ and the European Commission for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I think it is very timely. It is an important discussion. What I will share with you today, I am the director of the Middle East Regional Technical Assistance Center, known as METAC. I will share with you our experience in the region, and also I will touch on how the IMF work, how they approach our work in fragile members. Before I discuss IMF engagement in fragile state, I would like to briefly say a few words about METAC. It was established in 2004 in Beirut. The idea behind it was to help post-conflict countries and fragile states. So currently, it is an effort between the IMF. It is a collaborative effort between the IMF and several multilateral and bilateral donors, including GIZ and the European Union. METAC provides technical assistance in all areas of macroeconomics. I will focus on PFM-related issues. This is a topic today. Now, currently, we cover 10 countries, 7 of which are classified as fragile states according to the IMF classifications. So we provide technical assistance and training now to Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Sudan, Syria, West Bank and Gaza, and Yemen. And as of May 2016, we will start what we will call the next funding cycle. It will go for 5 years. We'll cover 4 additional countries. They're not classified as fragile state. They're Algeria, Djibouti, Tunisia, and Morocco. What I will do now, I will tell you what type of technical assistance we have been providing in the region for fragile state and non-fragile state. Then I will share with you our experience, what have been the results. So the type of PFM, technical assistance and training, I'm not going to mention everything because they're known to everyone, but I will focus on integration of current and capital budget through program budgeting and top-down budget preparation, budget preparation and medium-term planning, cash management, financial planning and banking arrangement for treasury single account, which is a serious issue in many countries. You find some governments have hundreds of bank accounts in these countries I mentioned, expenditure analysis, developing PFM reform strategies, capacity building for macro fiscal units, medium-term fiscal framework, and international public sector accounting standards. What's our experience have been? What we know, there is no one way to sequence PFM. What we need to do, we need to take the preconditions on the ground, we need to take step by step. And I will elaborate more on this issue. Now, what we have found out is there limited capacity in most of the fragile state in the region we are covering. But the capacities varies from one country to another. So the priorities varied from one country to another. Now, PFM reform should be kept simple in our opinion and do the basics first. It has been mentioned in the presentation a few minutes ago. Then after we build, the officials will feel confident with reform. Many of these countries, they never implemented reform. Then we can move to the second and third stage of PFM reforms. PFM reforms are feasible even in a challenging post-conflict environment with very low skills, initially low skills. We saw success. Afghanistan has been mentioned as a case where progress has been made. Sudan is another case where Treasury single account has been implemented, and the West Bank and Gaza. Now, in most of METAC countries, the countries I mentioned, the greatest progress we have seen, it's on budget execution. Progress on budget planning and on budget accountability has been limited. Again, we need to be realistic. Advanced budget planning reforms such as result-based budgeting or performance budgeting have typically not succeeded. Instead, in our review, reformers should consider focusing on the basics first by developing simpler ways to relate inputs and outputs in the presentation of budgets. Now, one issue which is very important is state legitimacy. Reforms to enhance transparency is a must, and accountability need to be initiated early, because these kind of measures take time for them to gain traction. Now, in most countries, a greater and more sustained attention to capacity is needed. Here we're talking about the human capital. So we need to consider civil service reform. We face a lot of turnover of senior staff and even at mid-level staff. One issue that we can address in the short term is to have long-term advisors from abroad to help in the implementation of the reform program. Now, also what we have found out, then countries that are implementing IMF programs, PFM reforms have succeeded or have done significantly better when there is no IMF program. A reason, as you know, IMF program have conditionality on structural reforms, and we focus on budget item. I'll share with you one example. Our expert in Beirut on PFM usually goes to the region when they are negotiating a program with the countries, and will talk with the authorities and agree on benchmark that are doable, consistent with the implementation capacity, but will make a difference. Then there is a framework for the authorities and for everyone to push PFM reforms. Now, one issue, a strong commitment from senior staff is essential but not sufficient. So you cannot have PFM reform program externally driven. You need to have the buy-in of the institution. Because if you have a minister that is pushing for PFM, but there is no buy-in at the institutional level, minister leaves, then we see a reform stall. Now,
Ahmed, you'll have to
okay.
just have to wrap up very quickly because
Okay,
I have
in 1 minute, let me say quickly how the IMF is helping in fragile state. Many of you know, over the years, the IMF engaged extensively in countries in fragile states. We clearly we provide lending on concessional terms. We provide technical assistance, and at the same time, the IMF, the idea is to have a stable macroeconomic environment, and we have certain guidelines when we engage in fragile state. Let me briefly mention them, then we can discuss them during the question and answer session. More explicit consideration of the political context. We cannot be unrealistic when we're designing both technical assistance program and financial programs. A well-tailored pace of macroeconomic adjustment. Opportunities for quick wins. Policies must be inclusive growth and protect social expenditure. Well-tailored structural reforms and related to our discussion, integrated capacity building, meaning here the adoption of an effective implementation of key structural or institutional measure should be supported by targeted and timely TA, technical assistance, and training. I would stop here, then we can address many of these issues during the question and answer session.
Absolutely,
Thank you.
Mohammed, because I'm sure there will be quite a few questions on how you actually walk this talk when it comes to practice, and of course also how the refugee crisis in the region is impacting on IMF programs. Which brings me very nicely actually to Moomin Rashid here, because Lebanon, Moomin, is in the eye of the storm. I mean, you have received, Munir, I misspoke your name. I do apologize. So Munir, Lebanon is obviously in the eye of the storm, and you have, I think, the largest number of refugees from Syria in your country. How is that affecting all the principles, how all the programming, all the theory, if you like, of assistance to fragile states in a country like yours?
Thank you very much, and also thank you for the invitation. First, let me say a few words on the attempt by the government of Lebanon to introduce public financial reform. We have been trying to enhance our public financial performance since the end of the civil war in 1990. Progress has been slow. We have introduced some reforms in a successful manner, especially in tax reform, in budget preparation, in expenditure execution, but the level of success has been limited. There are many reasons. Some of them were mentioned and they apply to Lebanon by Stephanie and Svenja. But an important component in preventing Lebanon from fully applying reform is the absorptive capacity of the civil servants at each ministry. And sometimes the reform that's being proposed is at a sophisticated level, as they mentioned, that prevents the ability of the civil servants to absorb it and apply it, especially when it comes to, for instance, in budget preparation, in internal and external audit. Now, the progress then has been achieved by Lebanon up to the advent of the Syrian crisis has been sort of fragmented and limited. So, and all of Lebanon, of course, had many crises before, and one of them is 2006, and so on, to deal with the war, how to deal with the aftermath of the war. But the crisis in Syria ended up, as you mentioned, with about 1.1 million Syrian refugees registered with the UNHCR. Out of total population of 4 million, we also have unregistered refugees, and on top of that, we have about 5 million, we have 500,000 Palestinian refugees who have been in Lebanon since 48. Their number increased. There were 100,000. They became 500,000. So we have this 1.6 million of refugees in total over a population of 4 million. The magnitude, the size of this, not only the absolute number, but relative to our population, it's very high. It's nearly 40%. Also, the area of Lebanon, some of you may know, is only 10,000 square meters. It's very small. So we are getting crowded with, even in terms physically, we are very crowded. So how did we deal with it? Actually, we didn't deal with it. It's, progressing on a daily basis without any strategy. So the inflow of the Syrians basically ended up by sharing our resources, sharing the resources with the Lebanese. For instance, in our budget, if we take debt service, Lebanon is highly indebted, which is about 30% of the budget, and we have civil servant salaries, another 30%. We have the remainder is about 30%, 33%, which is shared by the Syrians. How the Syrians are sharing it by using the educational system, by using the health facilities, by using our infrastructure, water, transportation, electricity, which is subsidized. So this has really a big burden on Lebanon. Now, the implication of weak public financial system management in Lebanon ended up in the reluctance of the donor community to engage fully in Lebanon. So far, we have received direct assistance to the Lebanese government over the 5 years of about $70 million. which is negligible to the amount that we have been spending on the Syrian population. Some of the assistance is being directly channeled to the refugees. That's fine. I mean, the donor community can provide assistance to the refugees, but they are not even providing them with enough assistance because they are using our hospitals, they are using our schools. We are welcoming the refugees in general, but we cannot cope with it. I don't want to go into the detail. For instance, we are having an employment problem among the Lebanese because of the inflow of the Syrians. They are taking the jobs, replacing Lebanese in many jobs. They are ready to take, because they are more distressed, they are taking to take lower salaries and so on. So I was recently in a meeting in London, just 4 days ago, and the idea was how to come with innovative approaches to deal with financing and how to deal with the refugees, to what extent to use the local capacity, government channels, and so on. There were some ideas, but nothing really that materialized, just was sort of ideas floating among participants. But what Lebanon needs to find an effective means, even if the donors, if they have the capacity, to come in and spend directly, that's fine. I don't think, of course, the Lebanese government, our governance level is low rated. This is preventing donors from being very ambitious and forthcoming with assistance, but they can overcome this by, for instance, creating a body that oversees how to deal with the impact of the refugees in Lebanon. So we are requesting that the donor community be further engaged in relieving the pressure on Lebanon, both the financial pressure and the social pressure, because there are lots of implications of the presence of 1.1 million additional refugees over a short period of time. And you know, in Europe, they have problem with, all of Europe has problem with 1 million among, what's the total population of Europe? 400 million, 500 million? And we are coping, 4 million are coping with 1.1 million in addition to the Palestinians. And we are concerned whether, because some of the ideas are floating, how to find them jobs. Lebanon absorptive capacity is very limited in terms of employment. Many Lebanese go abroad to live. One thing unique about the presence of Syrians, there's more integration of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon than any other country in the region like Jordan and Turkey. Actually, until recently, you were not able to see them. There are no camps. Recently, they started because the number has increased. After the number went up above 800,000, they started to to build camps because the rent started to rise up, because lots of available rent in Lebanon, because many Lebanese during the war have been displaced as well. So this is the case, and we'll take your questions later on. Thank you.
Just a very quick follow-up, Munir. So the direct assistance that you've received in response to the refugee influx has been no higher than $70 million?
They created a trust fund. The trust fund to deal with Syrian refugees is about 70 million only. The latest number I know.
Right. Okay.
I mean, the refugees have been receiving about 600 million through direct spending, okay, for education, because they built second shift education and clinics and health services and so on by the donor community and through the United Nations.
Right. So hence your appeal to create a special body, special entity to deal with these issues of the sharing.
I mean, it's either, to be honest with you, Lebanon by itself, even in terms of its institutions, cannot deal with the 1 million. Right. If somebody is channeling, let's say, $1 or $2 billion to deal with the refugees, we don't have the capacity to handle this amount. Right. So it needs physical assistance also to be handled, this, to deal with the size of the crisis.
Right. Thank you very much. Verena, hi. Having heard Munir, I think the question does go to you on how the World Bank views the state of Lebanon at the moment as it grapples with the refugee challenge, but also the wider issue of how the World Bank is dealing with the states in fragile states.
Thank you very much. Are you able to hear me well?
Very well, thank you. Very well, thank you. No, that was a curse.
All right, sorry, the system goes a little bit on and off. So, this has been a very interesting and rich discussion, and my particular experience builds on a review that we did about 3 years ago of 8 different country experiences, including some in MENA, some in Africa, Afghanistan. And then more recently, I've been working especially on South Sudan and on trying to find ways of strengthening public financial management systems in a context like South Sudan. And we've worked there closely also with the EU colleagues, as well as with the Budget Strengthening Initiative. So the experience really has been, there's a very wide variety of contexts that we engage in, and there's quite a range of what we are being called on to do as the World Bank. So in some situations, Central African Republic, currently also Somalia, we're being called on to fund some of the recurrent costs in the budget. And that typically comes with then quite intrusive levels of oversight of how budgets are allocated and how budgets are spent. In other situations, our role is much more limited to supporting capacity development, sort of more classical TA type of engagement. And then there are situations where we're sort of going back and forth, whether we're doing one thing or the other thing. So that's where we are currently in South Sudan. And there's also, of course, different situations in terms of what is the relationship and what's the division of labor among the different development partners engaging on public financial management. So, for example, when we started engaging on South Sudan, we had very strong engagement from the United States in this area. And then with the renewed outbreak of conflict, they decided to withdraw from that for a variety of reasons. So really one thing that stands out for us is how to continue engagement and how to program our engagement through periods of volatility, and also economic volatility and volatility in terms of falling back into conflict, and unpredictability in terms of also what other development partners are doing. A few lessons that we are beginning to take out of this, and again, there's a lot of variety, is really to keep an eye on what's the initial strength of commitment, what's sort of the environment, what is it that we should be expecting, and perhaps also, and that we're not really there yet, trying to form a good understanding of the baseline so that we have some sense of, are we actually getting traction? Are we actually making progress? That can sometimes be difficult to judge. And of course, things can also slide backwards. That's not something we should not be expecting in these difficult environments. We have the PIFA as a tool which measures some useful aspects. We probably need to, I think the theme has come out in different contributions, pay significant attention to the level of capacity and whether that's sort of strengthening and deepening over time. And if we have too much external support in there, as we've seen in South Sudan, then what have to be pulled out, and as I think is also currently the case in Yemen. So those are issues that we need to consider. We are trying to advocate for building in-country systems for learning. So for example, in Liberia, we've supported a financial management training program where we've recruited nationals into a training program of a year or two to really help them become effective and well-grounded accountants and procurement specialists who can then go into Ministry of Finance as well as into the line ministries and build the backbone of local capacity. And there's still issues, of course, with the levels of pay and how we can match what people expect and what a government can sustain But those are efforts to try and really embed capacity over time. I hope this didn't break off too much. Let me stop here.
Thank you. No, it was quite clear. Verena, just a question about coordination, because you are so many different donors working in different contexts, different countries. What is the state of coordination? Do you think of that as something quite important for you, or are you content to work in different sort of sectors and tracks?
Well, coordination is, I have, at least in South Sudan, it's been really challenging. We've invested now in having much more regular meetings with the different key players. One lesson that we really take away from it, though, is also that it's a moving field. So you have programs that are being stopped, then there's delays in planning because maybe the different development partners aren't quite sure yet, on their own when they would come back in. There's a diplomatic level discussions on this. So there's also the connection between this diplomatic level and the technical level of who comes in with what programming when.
Sorry, I can't hear you now. Yeah.
And also really, we have been trying.
We're losing you a little bit, Verena.
So that they can get support for the different aspects, budget planning, treasury systems, external audit, internal audit, so that they can sort of prepare certain packages and say, well, here we really need this amount to go deep enough. Otherwise, we have the risk of a lot of thinly spread assistance.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Verena. I'm sure there'll be questions to you. We'll come back to you in a few minutes. Philipp, you've been listening patiently to the different donors talking about their ideas. A lot of good principles, good advice, I think. But what is it like, really, from your point of view as an academic, as somebody who watches this and looks at it very closely?
Well, thank you very much. How do I start this? Well, I think I should probably start with a confession. So at ODI, we've been working on public financial management in fragile states and low capacity environments as a priority area probably for about 7 or 8 years now. So a lot of the countries that were mentioned already here are countries where we have various levels of engagement. However, and this is the confession part, I think I still don't know what fragile states actually are. And I'm beginning to wonder that if you have a category that encompasses countries like Colombia, encompasses countries like Jordan, and then countries like the South Sudan or the Central African Republic, then maybe that's just a fairly useless category. I think what fragile states have mostly in common is that donors and international agencies think of them as fragile, and therefore approach them with a set of instruments that is particularly geared towards fragile states. I happen to think that that's a useful set of instruments because it usually comes with a higher level of flexibility, a lower threshold for fiduciary concerns, and for the most part, these are going to be things that serve the needs of the countries concerned. However, if you were to talk about and I think this came out very strongly in the discussion already, and something that I definitely support. If you think about these are the 5 things that every fragile state needs, or these are the 5 sort of PFM elements or building blocks that every fragile state needs, you're invariably going to come up with 5 things that are going to be fairly unhelpful for the majority of countries, because every fragile state just happens to be fragile in their own special way, and therefore is going to require things that are very tailored to their particular context. Now, nowadays, everybody is talking about doing context-specific reforms. So let me just be maybe a little bit more concrete and maybe slightly more provocative about what that might mean in practice. Now, the first thing that I would say is that fragile states are going to be helped by and large by having stronger public financial management systems. However, that is sort of inherent in the definition. Because we define fragile states as states that are less able to cope with exogenous shocks and different kinds of stress. And we define public financial management systems essentially as the tools and mechanisms of the state to spend money well. So you're essentially saying, what's a good example? I am unhealthy because my health is not good. Now, if I strengthen my health or a crucial element of my health, then I'm going to be a healthier person. That's true, but it's not a question of whether this is a good idea. The question is how and what are the specific elements of public financial management that in many situations are going to be more helpful than others. And I think listening, for instance, to the presentation from Lebanon, it also strikes me that there will be many instances where public financial management systems are maybe not the most important thing that a fragile state or a country under stress needs to deal with the problems that they are facing right now. I think if you are the government of Lebanon today, you can probably wait for your PIFA scores to improve over the course of the next 10 years, but what you really need is just lots of money. And that would be a very tangible and a very, very specific solution to many of the problems that the country faces. Now, in terms of systems, and I realize that I'm completely contradicting myself, what we are finding is that there are maybe certain patterns that hold true not across all countries, but across many countries. And I think the logic behind that is that what you're essentially looking for are elements of public financial management that solve specific problems for specific people in government. And I'm using specific people in government advisedly here. I don't think it's very useful to talk about the political will of the government, because we all know that that really doesn't exist. If that was a requirement for reforms to succeed, no reforms would ever succeed. But even in the most fragile state, even in the most fragmented governments, there is going to be somebody. Even if politicians are not interested, senior civil servants might be interested. Even if senior civil servants might be not interested because they are compromised or because they are corrupt, mid-level technocrats might be interested. And there will be certain kinds of solutions that, or systemic improvements that are going to work better if you attach them to mid-level bureaucrats. For instance, you can do a lot of things on the downstream budgeting side, like TSA reforms being one example, where you can sneak things past politicians which you couldn't do if you were interested in medium-term budgeting. And so I don't think it's very surprising to find that this is sort of the balance that we are seeing in many fragile states. You can explain to a non-PFM expert why what we describe as downstream PFM reform, which is about controlling the flow of money through government, is something that is important to lots of people who are in charge of governments in fragile states, whereas medium-term budgeting, performance budgeting, different kinds of accounting reforms are just not important because they're not urgent and they are probably a waste of time. There are other things like, and let me maybe make that the last point, there are other issues like transparency, participation, which they might pay off over the next 10 years, over the next 15 years. They are very likely not going to be the problems that are on the forefront of decision makers' minds today. And there are lots of countries that are doing perfectly fine, that are rich, prosperous, and not fragile. And yet they're intransparent and they don't have a lot of participation. So focusing these things on the needs of decision makers in countries is probably going to force you to make decisions that you're not always comfortable with from a normative standpoint, because many people who run fragile states, present company obviously excluded, just happen to be not very nice people.
Okay, that's a fair point. If you had one piece of advice to the donors that are here around the table, what would that advice be? Very quickly.
Never do any PIFA assessments ever again.
Okay. Natalie, how would you respond to that? And also, your comments very quickly about what you've heard so far.
I agree that, yes, a massive financial massive response is in most of the cases the most urgent things to do, but you can't come with a massive response without starting working on the structure, and the PFM is one of the essential structure of a governance, of a democratic governance, and this is really useful to combine both things together. At the beginning, that could be very, very slow in some countries that we have in our portfolio. Verena has, and I think also Mohamed were talking about Central African Republic. This is really an example where the fragility is really extreme in terms of PFM. Guinea-Bissau, even Madagascar, this type of country. This is really difficult to combine both things together, because they really need to get massive financial support in order to just to be able to pay the salary at the end of the month. That's very at this level, and to combine the key core function to just be able to put somewhere the money. So to get a budget which does exist, to have a treasury committee, very basic function which have to be in place, and then we can start to think about more medium-term reform. And I really think, I'm not sure that PIFA is not a good instrument. I share with you the idea that yes, PIFA is not the instrument to build a short-term PFM action plan or even a medium term, but this is a diagnostic tool which is very important. This is one among some other, but I think that the importance of PIFA is that this is something which is shared by all around the world, so this is why this is an important diagnostic tool.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to formulate your questions. Please put up your hand, identify yourself. I think there's a roving microphone that we've got about 25 minutes or so for a Q&A. Mohammed, I will come back to you. So when after the question is asked, I'll give you a chance to add on this bit. So the gentleman over here, can I see a show of hands? Are there other people who would like to come in at this point with questions to the panelists? Not yet. Okay, the gentleman over here.
Thank you. I'm Ghanshyam Mandari. I'm the counselor from Embassy of Nepal. First of all, thank you very much. I've heard of the works that GIZ has done in Nepal, but by coming to this program, I could know what particular areas that it has focused in. So really took this advantage. I don't want to comment on the technical parts, which I'm not very much into, but rather than the question, I have a quick comment about the definition of the fragile state or fragility that has featured so much in the panel discussion as well. And thank you all for this rich panel. But my comment on this is, I think we should also think about the political correctness when we say fragile state, rather than having a big title saying, okay, PFM or something in fragile state. Maybe as the last speaker very rightly said, it might be useful for some institutions to put certain countries under the category for their operational purposes. But then when we say fragile states, country A, B, C, these are the fragile states, and because of this is a debatable thing, and I think we should think about that political correctness. Instead of saying fragile state, okay, dealing with this country during distress, or during humanitarian crisis, or during fragility, that might be the right way. Because saying that, for example, Nepal is a fragile state, I don't know whether this is the right way to go forward. The next thing is about the approaches that have come, which again featured very well during the panel. We need to be careful about the context. Again, coming back to the definition, one country might be fragile because of certain context, so the situatedness, the contextuality of a country might be certainly different from the other countries. So having one size fits all definition for all countries might be problematic. So I just would like to take this opportunity to comment on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very valid points. Are we being too simplistic in defining what a fragile state is? Is there anyone else who would like to come in on this or other points at this stage? Not yet. Okay. Mohammed, why don't we kick off with you to comment and answer some of these?
I mean, the discussion this afternoon has been on PFM, but I think we have to be realistic. We need to look at the entire macro picture. We need to have a macro framework with stable macro environment. We need to talk about PFM. We need to talk about revenue administration, statistics. We need to talk about all different components. In particular, also, we need to talk about when we're asking countries sometimes to implement structural reform and to take measure, they need financing. So the fund and the World Bank, for example, they do have facilities to give financing on concessional terms. So the international community is there. Let's be honest here. What's missing sometimes is a political commitment and the ownership from the authorities. Recently, the IMF, every few years, the IMF takes stock of our engagement on different policies. In May 2015, we took an assessment of our engagement. I apologize for using the term fragile states. We sent questionnaire and we received the input from the authorities in fragile states. They like everything we're doing in terms of capacity building. They like more concessional financing, which sometimes cannot be realistic for one simple reason. We need to protect the lending we are giving. They need to build a track record. So it is a joint effort. What in our work in the METAC region, in particular in the countries I'm working on, sometimes we provide technical assistance. We call after 3-4 months, they forgot about the technical assistant. So it's not all on the international community. So to overcome this issue, the fund recently came up with a proposal, what we call a capacity building proposal. So the way it's going to work, it's still a proposal. We're going to take stock of all the TA needs in the country, what the institutional reform should be, what every donor is doing, and what kind of technical assistance is needed, long-term advisors. Also, we're going, I mean, again, it's subject to funding. We need to find an advisor, a person on the ground to manage the technical assistant. Because sometimes we see a lot of duplication of technical assistance. So I think we are at a point, but in countries, for example, where we see the authorities have taken ownership, we see reform accelerated and the standard of living improved. Now, an inclusive growth on addressing certain issues, these we fine-tune these policies when the commitment is there. What is needed is really a comprehensive macro framework dealing with all aspects. And I think, Philippe, you mentioned on this issue, it's not only PFM. PFM is one issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Natalie, I was wondering if you could come back to this issue of the mass amount of money you need, but also what Philippe was talking about, also the management of it. So how do you coordinate between the humanitarian? So if you have a fragile state, it's in distress, there's a humanitarian crisis, the humanitarian community mobilizes very fast. How do you then, from your angle, go into this and try and bring in a certain degree of reform and sense to all how the money is used?
When we talk about state building contracts, this is the step after the humanitarian help. Of course, there is always a gray zone where the different instruments can be combined together. But when we come with a state building, for instance, after a natural disaster, as it was the case in for the earthquake in Nepal, we work on the macroeconomic and budget framework. So we look at what will be the macroeconomic impact, and not the direct impact of destruction. So this is we have specific support, and the other donor also specific humanitarian and support for the reconstruction. The state building, this is really to support the country at this moment to ensure the vital state function and to deliver basic service delivery. So this is more as also Verna has mentioned at the level of the recurrent functions. So to ensure the recurrent cost of the budget. So this is how this is combined with other type of modalities and financial support. And this is also why this is important to have at this moment a very strong coordination with other donors and to look at in detail who is doing what and who is and to have also a joint assessment as much as we can and to share the implementation.
Right. Any other points that someone wants to come in at this point? Okay, not. Verena, I want to turn to you again, and the same question as to Nathalie, but also the point made by our colleague here about being too simplistic in defining fragile states. Are we on the wrong track? Are we being politically incorrect when we talk about that? And does that make our work more difficult when it comes to actually working on good financial governance in these countries?
Thank you. Should we use the term fragile state? I mean, it's not necessarily.
Verena, you'll have to. We cut off for a minute.
The New Deal.
Can you just go back? Verena, can you just go back slightly because we missed a bit of what you were saying?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So I mean, it's a difficult term to use. It does comprise a wide range of countries. So it's different from saying low-income country, middle-income country, because we have fragile states that are middle-income or have been middle-income prior to conflict. And we have those that are very low-income or that have been very underdeveloped. So South Sudan is a classic area that has never seen a lot of development in its history. And so that's very different from Libya or Syria. But still, what is the characteristic is the presence of violence. Is the connection still good enough?
Go on, yeah. Comes and goes, but go ahead.
All right.
Yeah.
So, the presence of violence and also the volatility are quite common issues. So we have to be mindful of commonalities as well as that within fragile states there's a wide range of situations. But it's environments in which it's harder to work than in a stable context. There's more things that are unpredictable. The constitutional process in Nepal, trying to organize elections, trying to have a constitution that sort of creates a stable framework again, has been exceedingly challenging and has drawn out over many years. But that's something that we find in many fragile environments. There's been also discussions over a new constitution in Yemen, that problem in South Sudan. So we have to find instruments with which and ways to engage in these more challenging environments. And we need more flexibility. And we also need sometimes more funding, more overhead funding, for example, than we need for engagement in stable environments. It's quite something that we haven't touched on is that it can be quite costly to provide effective technical assistance, to provide effective engagement. Humanitarian assistance is quite a costly endeavor. Bringing people into insecure environments, they usually ask for extra funding. So in terms of thinking about our tools and what risk appetite we have, I think that's where the category makes a degree of sense. Again, the context can really vary a lot. Middle income, low income, there's countries that have very scarce fiscal resources and are those that are resource rich, as East Timor became after some time, as South Sudan was in the early stages, and that have relatively large budgets. So that also exists.
Right, thank you. And of course, there's the problem that Stephanie and Sonia pointed to about having to leave conflicts and sort of leave the work you're doing behind for that period where you're not secure working in a secure environment. There's that aspect of things as well.
Well, we try to continue even during insecurity, sometimes through reverse missions where we bring some people to places outside the country. We have done that with our counterparts in Libya. But again, that adds to costs and it limits who we work with. It also speaks to we really have to build up capacities of people internally to the extent that's possible. And, you know, even a quarter staff of 10, 20 can make a big difference in a Ministry of Finance.
Right. Thank you very much. I'll turn to you in a minute, Munir, but I'll take a question from the floor. Please.
Maybe more a comment than a question. My name is Luc Lerut from DEFCO, but also IMF. On the question of fragility, of course, the term may not be good. It's true also that it covers a number of countries, but it's true also that one size does not fit all. It's equally true that no size fits me is not a useful concept. So I would sort of take that as something that covers a number of places where there is volatility. And indeed, where a PFA can actually give a lot of information about what is going on. It's a stock-take operation, and I think it serves a purpose. And I agree with my colleague from METAC, actually, not surprisingly, I suppose, that there are countries where statistics is a very important affair. If you have a resource-rich country that is volatile, one of the volatility that you will see is that all these ministers will simply disagree on basic assumptions, including the price of oil. Having a good statistics base, good data to work on is simply something useful. The country is fragile, but at least there is one type of debate that is avoided. I think that is also true for countries that are very poor. Basics first, that's true. That's something that we say between PFM experts, actually. What it covers is rather complex. But just simply having good liquidity management is something that is absolutely indispensable. And we donors should also carry the blame a little bit because all these accrual accounting, program budgeting, all these things that started somewhere in the south of the Pacific meant, for example, that the Cook Islands did not have accounts for 4 years in a row because they were busy assessing the value of their water system. So, my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Very useful comment. Munir, would you like to come in at this point? In general, because, and also the comment that was made, but more generally, because do you feel uncomfortable being designated fragile state? Or are you not designated?
Actually, fragility is a dynamic concept.
Context.
Because before the advent of the Syrian crisis, the inflow of a large number of Syrians, we're not fragile state. We were not. The economy was not properly managed, and we had many problems in public financial management, in spite of the effort to improve it. But with the advent of the Syrian crisis, we became fragile state. We had, as I said, we have to deal with about over 1.1 million additional population to population 4 million. And if you do simple calculations, the budget, if we take from it, as I said, wages and interest on the debt, we have to share that with an additional 30% of the population. So there is less for everybody to receive in terms of government services. So this created lots of. There's also other impact of the crisis. It's the impact in the economy. I didn't say all the implications. Our growth rate has become almost zero instead of 4%. The World Bank estimates that we have lost over the 5 years in economic activity $13 billion. So we're using about over $2.5 to $3 billion from economic activities. We have the land transportation have been cut off completely, which affected our trade, it affected our exports. Cost of transportation, cost of imports have increased, and also the cost that I didn't really cite all the costs. For instance, we have problem with internal security. There's tension. It's created tension among the Lebanese. For 2 years, we haven't been able to elect a president. All of it related to the Syrian crisis. And there is division with Lebanon to what extent we should engaged in preventing, should we take advanced action to prevent ISIS from coming to Lebanon? And as many of you don't know, ISIS occupies actually a portion of Lebanon in the northeast, and there's fighting with the Lebanese army inside Lebanese territory. And this is a big challenge for us. So we became fragile because of this. In terms of the financial costs and so on, it's very difficult to define specific amounts. We have been asking over a period of 5 years for assistance of about $11 billion from 2016 to 2020, which I don't think it's a large amount of money for the needs of the circumstances over this period. Thank you.
Though you did initially say the absorption capacity is a challenge in a country like yours. For
No,
such
I was talking about, of course, the absorption of the refugees is a problem by itself.
For sure.
But also, I was talking about PFM reform, because the quality of the civil, as many governments, the salary scale is lower than other areas. So the quality of the civil service is limited, and the number also is limited. That prevents us from being able to absorb the technical assistance and the more sophisticated. I'm working also, I work on, in addition to being advisor to the minister, I work in capacity building. And, I don't have enough counterparts to be able to teach them how to do, for instance, medium-term budgeting, performance budgeting, and all these concepts.
I just wonder if Sonia and Stephanie, if you want to ask any specific questions to the panelists linked to your PowerPoint and your recommendations? Think about it. You don't want to? Okay, that's fine as well. Yes, very quickly, Mohammed, because I want to give the floor to
just
Philippe again.
one quick comment on capacity building. I think the fund, we have moved now to the field. We have 9 regional technical assistance centers like METAC. We have training center for each country. On an annual basis, we have a complete technical assistance program and at the same time a training program. So the same people who receive the technical assistance, they're receiving the training. We're building capacity, and we strongly believe the regional technical assistance center, we are close to the authorities. Our advisors are in close contact with the counterparts. One important issue for the fragile state, meaning in our case, when we cannot travel to the country because of security reason, we bring them outside, off-site, we're delivering technical assistance. We strongly believe that it's important to remain engaged, so when the situation stabilizes like Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, that we know what the situation on the ground. We can hit the ground running. That's.
Do you think, Philippe, that there can ever be preparedness in the real sense of the word for a suddenly fragile state? I mean, can we foresee this thing coming? We haven't been able to see it in many cases just recently around us. And your one policy advice, if there was one for the donors around the table, what would it be? You said give us some earlier, but having listened to everything up to now, what would you say needs to be done? Is it the coherence? Is it the long term, the long haul? Is it the flexibility? Is it the money?
Right. So I don't think that it's going to be possible to predict fragility just because the nature of the challenges is so varied. Mm-hmm. We just heard about Lebanon, where a couple of years ago, absent a civil war in Syria, you would have probably said this is a country that has its problems.
Even Syria itself was a middle-income state.
Yes, there's actually much better examples still. And you would have considered it to be a fairly capable country, certainly capable enough of having a competent military and managing its internal affairs, internal stability in ways that are certainly quite unpleasant to some, but not a source of instability the way that it has turned out to be, and nobody has anticipated that. I think generally policymakers have a pretty good record of being fairly awful at predicting large-scale societal changes of that nature. It was the same thing with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, obviously. Now, in terms of advice, let me maybe focus on two things. The first one is related to this issue of fragility and how you want to define it. I think my advice there would be not to say we shouldn't use the term fragility or we should come up with something else. I think my conclusion from that would be to just not be too specific in what we conclude from having this very, very large and varied category, but rather be as flexible as possible in the response to fragility in any one country, because the causes of fragility are going to be so different. And that's hence my insistence on, I think PIFA assessments in fragile states are not just a complete waste of time, they're actively counterproductive because they focus people's attention on too many things, and they're essentially a crutch for donors who are not willing to spend more money on slightly more tailored and more complicated assessments of what the actual problems are, where you may be forced to say, in a country like Nepal, for instance, there's an earthquake to contend with in a very fragile constitutional situation. How do you deal with that? And some of the solutions are going to be PFM solutions, some of them might be payroll, public sector, civil service management solutions, others might be simple financing issues. And in a case like Lebanon or Jordan, the question is just how do you provide public services to 500,000 or 1 million people who weren't there a year ago? And that flexibility is something that instruments like PIFA don't give you. And on this issue, I would certainly second the point that Verena made, is we don't, I think, talk enough about the fact that many of these reforms, donor sort of supported reforms in fragile states, are going to fail. It's because they're fragile. And so a tolerance for unsuccessful activities and a tolerance for higher costs is something that is going to be very important for donors if they want to sort of do well by their fragile state clients, which really need external support in order to overcome these sorts of crises.
Right. So, Natalie, the final comment from you, I mean, just responding to what Philipp has said, I mean, do you think that this lack of flexibility does actually mar operations by donors, is an obstacle?
No, I really do not think that there is a lack of flexibility. State building contract on the EU side is clearly a response. We try to be as flexible as possible. And we are ready to reply and to come in a certain situation. We in less than 4 months to disburse the first tranche in a country where there was a risk of a state collapse. So it was really crucial to be able to come with the first disbursements, and that's true that in this case we start to look at the second step in terms of reform, PFM reform, in a second round. And this is why, in this particular case, if we do not have a PIFA assessment, of course, we are not waiting to have one. We use what we have. So that could be a PIFA if there is one. That could be IMF Fiscal Affairs Department assessment. That could be an assessment done by our delegation. We use what we have. But we use also what the partner country did already before, so that their previous PFM action plan strategy, and we take what is the most urgent to be implemented in order to be able to go ahead. And this is why I think that flexibility, yes, this is our concern, yes.
Right. So your hands are not tied by any definitive, let's say, chains in a sense. Verena, I'm going to wind up now, but do you have a final point you want to make since you're sitting in DC? Anything you want to say very quickly?
No, thank you very much. I've enjoyed following the discussion, and just to agree, indeed, in a fragile environment, there's many aims that we are pursuing. We have to keep mindful sort of what are the purposes that we hope PFM also will contribute to, resurrecting infrastructure, making sure that services are provided, and so on. And at the same time, being mindful that we won't be able to achieve all of this in a linear, direct way. That's not realistic, and we shouldn't go from being overly optimistic in some times and then to becoming overly pessimistic, or sort of adversarial at other times, because that also contributes to the disruptions that we already face from the countryside.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists. I'd just like to come back to the findings and the policy recommendations that the GIZ study has come up with, and I think we should keep this in mind as we leave. Number one was there has been good progress on financial governance, even through acute crisis. I think that's quite an interesting point to keep with us as we leave this room. They stress the need for a holistic approach on good financial governance, and I think that is also, we've talked about it as well, you need to bring all the different units together, the planning, the ministries, etc. And I think the need for political buy-in is something that you have stressed very much. So we come to the political commitment is key, and there we say identify pockets of political commitment and leverage this interest, and I think that is something that we have talked about. The fourth point the study says is foster pockets of strong capacity. That has been something that we've all talked about. And the final point, of course, is that we've repeated throughout here is donor coordination is very necessary. And that I think has to be the key. And I've been following these and other issues in development for a very long time. And I've seen throughout the years how crucial donor coordination is. And as we face this refugee crisis of epic proportions, I think that becomes even clearer. We cannot afford anymore, from the humanitarian point of view, but also from a financial point of view, to be going on different tracks. We really need to work together. So with that, I'd like to bring this panel discussion to an end. I'd like to thank our panelists, but also Sonia and Stephanie for their input, and thank you for GIZ for holding this. And I think the next C4C is going to be in a couple of months or a couple of weeks, and I keep aware of this happening. So thank you very much, and please join me in saying thank you very much.